to leave time for so I will try to leave time for questions at the end, but I'm also happy, people can raise their hand and send chats to ask questions as we're going. That's totally fine by me. And hopefully with Tiffany's help or others, can help flag them as we're going. There are special rules for SNAP eligibility for people who qualify under those rules as students, and we'll talk more about what that means. This is an area that was not significantly changed by the new federal law. There were changes to other work requirements, but not that didn't really affect college student eligibility. These rules apply to students who are ages 18 to 49, who are enrolled half-time or more in an institution of higher education. If they fall within that category, they have to meet the rules call them an exemption in order to qualify for SNAP benefits. And as I was mentioning, these rules are different from what are known as the able-bodied adults without dependents, or ABOD work requirements. You may have heard a lot about those recently because of the federal changes. So if someone is 18 or older and meets these student eligibility rules that we're going to talk about right now, then they would be exempt from those ABOD rules. And so what for SNAP purposes, what constitutes an institution of higher education? It means you're enrolled in a regular curriculum at a college or university that offers degrees, or a business, technical, trade, or vocational school that normally requires a high school diploma or the equivalent, such as a GED. If you're enrolled in classes, English as a second language, or you're enrolled in a GED course or adult basic education, those would not count. The school, college, or school that you're enrolled in, the institution would determine what constitutes half-time enrollment. So there's no sort of definition under the SNAP rules. You really look to what the school considers that to be. So again, if you fall within this group and you're subject to these student rules, you have to meet one of the following exemptions on the next two slides in order to qualify for SNAP. And I probably should have said this at the first slide. This may be obvious, but just to clearly state it, you still have to meet all the other, SNAP rules. So you still have to, verify your income. If you're subject to an asset test, you have to verify your assets. Most people aren't, but some still are. So all of those sorts of things, you still have to qualify, meet the citizenship or immigration status rules. So, you still do all of that. And then these are added rules that a lot of other people don't have to meet because they're not enrolled in college or another institution. So if you're under 18 or age 50 or older, then you're exempt. Physically or mentally unfit for working is another category. You also have to, or you can be working 20 hours per week or 80 hours per month in paid employment. You could be participating in a state or federally funded work study program, an on-the-job training program, or you're responsible for caring for a dependent child under the age of 6. These are additional rules that continue, or additional exemptions, excuse me. If you're caring for a dependent child between the ages of 6 to 11, and you lack the necessary child care to attend school and work 20 hours per week, or the child care is an issue that's preventing you from participating in work study, then you would also be exempt. If you're a single parent enrolled full-time and responsible for a dependent child under 12, then you're exempt. So again, you don't have to be enrolled full-time to fall within these rules, but if you're a single parent and you are enrolled full-time with a child under 12, then that's a separate exemption. If you're enrolled in financial assistance for needy families, FANF, then you'd be exempt, or if you're enrolled through a state or federally approved employment and training program. Um, and so how would you verify some of this? Here are some of the examples of verification that would be the person would need to provide in order to demonstrate that they fall within these rules and meet the rules. So in terms of verifying the enrollment, verbal or written contact with the school is sufficient. Usually, typically, the department is asking for written contact. That's some sort of documentation, just because that's what I think DHHS staff are used to. But if there's an issue getting that, DHHS can have permission to speak with someone at the school who can verify. There can also be a statement from the student who's seeking SNAP of their intent to register for the next school term. I often get asked, how does someone show if they're physically or mentally unfit for work? The rules are, it's tough here. The rules say if it's evident, then their verification doesn't need to be provided. But we have never really gained clarity on how DHHS defines what is evidence. So I suspect most people are going to be asked to verify it, especially since so much is done through New Hampshire Easy and over the phone. So you do not have to be receiving a disability benefit. So the test is not, are you getting supplemental security income, SSI or SSDI, or some other form of short-term or long-term disability. If you are getting one of those benefits, then you would meet this category, but you don't need to be getting that benefit to meet it. So if you are getting, say, SSI, providing documentation, a fairly recent Social Security letter from the Social Security Administration would be sufficient. But if you're not getting one of those benefits, either maybe because you're applying for one and a determination hasn't been made, or even if you're not technically eligible for SSI, you can still meet this exemption as long as you get a signed statement from a provider that substantiates the claim you're making about your physical or mental unfitness for work. In terms of employment, this is kind of standard, that along the lines of what you would have to verify just with the normal SNAP rules. So verbal or written contact with the employer can satisfy it. Of course, employment records, pay stubs, if the person's self-employed, self-employment records that they have would all be sufficient. And for lack of childcare, you really just have to provide a signed statement. The applicant or recipient just self-attests in a signed written statement to not having childcare. Some other considerations to be mindful of. Students who are living with others may qualify for their own SNAP case without having to include those other people. For those where I've done a presentation before in the past, or we've talked about what's called the purchase and prepare rules. So there are certain people, and happy to answer questions to refresh people's memory. There are certain people who have to be on the SNAP case with you. And those are typically not all family, but typically you're talking about family, kids, spouses who have to be included regardless. But if, let's say, it's just a college student living with a roommate, that roommate doesn't have to be on the student's SNAP as long as they purchase and prepare most of their meals separately. DHHS will ask who else is in the household. They may ask for some verification that, fill out a form or a written statement that you're purchasing and preparing meals separately. But you don't, just because you have a roommate doesn't mean you both have to apply for SNAP on the same case. The next example I threw in just because this, may be a situation that might be more common for college students, but if the student is under 22 and living at home with their parents, then in that instance, there's a rule that says they have to apply for SNAP with their parents or be added to their parents' case. So even if, let's say they're 21 and, they're going to school and they're working part-time and, they essentially are doing their own thing, but they're still, living at their parents' home, but otherwise, maybe even preparing their own meals or purchasing their own meals separately. They still have to apply for SNAP because of the federal law that requires children under 22 to be on the same SNAP case as their parents. A quick note about how educational income is treated for a SNAP budget. Most federal aid and work study does not count as income for SNAP purposes. So when they're doing the SNAP budget and determining what amount the student will be eligible for, that federal aid is going to be excluded and not be part of that budget. However, if it's not federal aid and it's money used for housing and shelter, then it might be counted as countable income that would factor into the budget. If someone is a student and they're not eligible, so they fall within the student rules we've been talking about, they're within the appropriate age range, they're enrolled half-time or more in the institution of higher education, if they don't meet one of those exemptions, so they're not physically or mentally unfit for work, they're not working the required number of hours, they're considered an excluded household member if they're part of a SNAP household. So let's say, there's a parent with two kids who are still in like middle school or high school, and then there's a 20-year-old who's going to college. If that 20-year-old doesn't meet these exemptions, they're excluded from the case, but the mom and the two other kids would still receive SNAP. And the student who's excluded, any income they might have or resources that they might have are not counted. So you
Ray,
would
we
just,
have a question.
oh, sure.
A few questions, actually. Julie, go ahead. She has her hand raised.
Ray, could you just pop back to the third paragraph about the educational income? Students who receive a refund through the financial aid, Pell Grants or whatever, does that have to be declared? Some students get like $2,000 or $3,000 in October. Does that have to be declared,
And can you
reported?
just give me a little more details? I do know of Pell Grants, but when you say they get a refund, what do you mean by that?
So if the financial aid awarded to them is higher than the cost of their classes and their books, they will get refunded the difference.
Um, so let me double check and verify this after. I would have to pull something up, but I think because it's federal aid, it would be excluded. I don't think the refund would make a difference.
Okay.
I could try to just confirm that, um, um, but I think the distinction is really if it's not federal aid and used for housing and shelter.
Well, what do you mean by non-federal money used for housing and shelter? What kind of money is that?
So I would I uh I would, what comes to mind for me, to be honest, I haven't had a case like this, but would be sort of maybe a private scholarship that someone gets, where the scholarship is not paid directly to the institution, where the student is given the money and essentially they're able to do what they want with it. But they got it through some application or some qualification. And it's just a private, philanthropic organization that's trying to support students. The general policy for SNAP is if money is available to you to spend on things like food or housing and shelter, that's going to count as countable income. So there is a specific distinction made for the federal aid, but short of federal aid, it would likely need to be verified and counted. There may be some scholarships that would not count, but the way that the rule is written is if it's the student has access to it and it's to use for housing and shelter, then it would potentially count.
Is it just for housing and shelter? I'm sorry to be asking so many questions, but if we have like a couple of grants, and we can provide emergency money up to 750 from one of the grants. Now, if I give that money to a student and they're on SNAP, do they have to declare that 750 as income? It could be used for anything like rent to fixing brakes on their car to dental bills, anything, whatever's going on.
So that's an interesting question that would really be, I think, fact dependent. And here's why. Some other rules come into play. So
Of course.
So if it's not, if it's, so let's first start with the student rules. If it's not federal aid,
Mhm.
then it doesn't fall within that federal aid exception that I just mentioned that spurred your question. But there are other rules around what is countable income that may be implicated here. So if you, and I don't know if you do this at all, but if you were to pay that money directly to the student's landlord or pay it directly to the mechanic that's fixing their car, that would not count, because direct vendor payments don't count. So if if I'm lending a family member money to fix their car and I give them the $500 cash, uh, even though it's for their car, in theory, they have that cash, they could use it however they want. So that might be counted. But if they brought the car to the mechanic and then say, hey, can you help me pay $500 to fix, and I pay directly to the mechanic, that doesn't count for SNAP.
Do you think, sorry, do you
I
think there's
just
any recourse on the school if students are not reporting that money?
No, the obligations are on. I mean, I'm not, unless, for SNAP purposes, there would be no obligation on the school. Where obligations of reporting requirements come into play are for the SNAP recipients who are receiving the SNAP. They have the obligation to report certain changes depending on, you know, what the change is, depending on the household type for SNAP. There are instances sometimes where, if someone has an authorized representative, that maybe the authorized representative could have some obligation, but even then, not always. Really the obligation is on the SNAP household to
Okay.
report those changes.
So
But I
it
just
sounds
wanted
like the best course of action is to always pay the vendor if possible.
I would say yes. If this is like an emergency, money for certain emergencies like falling behind in rent or utilities or car repair, or honestly, even if it's to help with like emergency food, I would always say it's best to minimize, if the goal of the student is to minimize the impact on their public benefits, then the best thing to do is to pay the vendor or the bill, the utility company, the landlord directly. But the other income rule I just want to mention, and this is where it really gets fact dependent, and so it can be hard to give you a blanket answer, is um, the other kind of broad rule that applies is if the income that the family is or person is receiving is not expected to continue, so it's not regularly anticipated that they're going to keep receiving it. So if I'm loaning my a family member money $500 a month every month, and that's what I've agreed to, and that's expected, that has to be part of the budget. But if I loan them, $500 just for this one time thing, even if I don't pay the mechanic, there is an argument that that $500 shouldn't be counted in the budget and doesn't have to be reported because it's not reasonably expected to be ongoing. And because you're really looking at what is their income over the certification period for which they're going to be receiving SNAP. So
Right.
so that's why
I'm
it's
just,
it's oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm just worried because I know for a fact we've just given a scholarship of a couple of thousand to a student who I know is on SNAP. I just feel like they can't catch a break. I mean, that money is specifically to help the student catch up on a few things that are
Well,
so
so the advice there that I would say is, when in doubt, let DHHS know. There's no harm in reporting. It's best to be, even though a lot of times we are pushing back on DHHS because they tend to require people to over verify things that don't need to be verified. I think when a SNAP recipient is not sure, I would say let DHHS know, and then DHHS will issue a decision if it requires them to do something, and if that decision reduces or terminates their benefits, that's when they can be referred to 603 legal aid and NHLA, and we can take a look at it and see
okay.
was that the right decision or not.
Okay.
But definitely I would say, because the worst thing to do is to not report, because then you're risking an overpayment or you're risking an accusation of fraud. And so, um, it's really, like I said, as I was saying a little moment ago, about to say, it is really hard. I would be hesitant to tell you what exactly to do with this student without getting more information from you or the
Right.
student to, and unfortunately, I'm always happy to answer questions, but at NHLA, because of our limited resources, we really only can take cases once there's a notice of decision issued and the person is wondering
No, I
whether they should
understand.
appeal or wanting to know what their rights are. So I
But
would
the
say in
bottom
that
line
instance,
is, the bottom line is I should be encouraging students to report any of this scholarship grant money, that emergency fund money we're giving. We should be encouraging them to report to DHHS if they get SNAP.
I think on the safe side, absent more, I mean, I'm happy to have a conversation with you outside of this meeting and this
Okay.
presentation to get more details and see if there's, some general rule. And I'm sure, also, I think it would be good to reach out to DHHS too. I think there are people there at DHHS who could help you understand the rules too, from their perspective, and make sure, you know, but yeah, I think I'm just hesitant right now to say don't report it, but without knowing more
Right.
information.
No, if we could talk afterwards or at some other point, that would be fabulous. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
I'd
But the
love
one
to
thing I'm
join that.
confident in saying is if it's federal aid, they don't need to worry about that. I think the
Okay.
non-federal aid is where can get a little trickier.
Perfect.
And we'd want to make sure we have all the facts
Thank
to
you.
understand.
I love to join that conversation too, because we're in the same boat with some one-time emergency things that happen. So if we can,
Oh, Kristen, you're here.
yeah,
Hi.
that's Kristen. Sorry, Kristen from Manchester, same as Julie. So I'd love to.
Yeah,
see
so maybe Julie and Kristen, maybe we can set up a time. Maybe we can just set up a separate call, and whoever wants to join,
Perfect.
it could just be a brainstorming session to ask questions and
That would
think
be
through some of
great.
these issues.
Super helpful. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, no
That would be
problem.
great.
I have your email, so I'll reach out.
Sounds good. And please keep the other. Were there any questions in the chat? Tiffany,
Yeah,
I
Patty
haven't
has
checked
one
the
in the
chat.
chat.
Yes, there's one in the chat. Ray, would you be able to share about out-of-state students? They live here in New Hampshire while in school, but their residency is Massachusetts. Would they be able to apply in New Hampshire, or would they be able have to apply in Massachusetts?
That is a great question that I didn't anticipate, and that I would want to also follow up on. My subject to verification, my response right now is that if their residency is in Massachusetts and they're attending school in Massachusetts, then they would have to apply for benefits in Massachusetts. And the reason I say that is because the college student eligibility rules don't cease to apply during a summer break. So if the student is intending to stay in school in the fall semester, then these rules still apply even when they're home. And so the fact that they're going to school in Massachusetts, I think would be the key piece of why they would have to apply in Massachusetts. The
The
being
question
home
is they're going to school in New Hampshire,
oh, sorry,
but their
sorry,
residency is Massachusetts.
sorry, I flipped that in my mind.
Okay.
Then reverse what I said. But where they're going to school is the key. So they would apply in New Hampshire, and going home to Massachusetts in the summer would not trigger them, the need to apply in Massachusetts or to close their case. You can be temporary if you intend to maintain your residency in the state. Then you can continue to receive SNAP, and you can even use your SNAP benefits out of state. And so that I think is the key piece, in not even just for the college student rules. I think for non-college students, where you intend to keep your residency is usually the test. And so I think it becomes a harder question, I guess, if they're not sure if they're coming back to school for the fall semester. Then I think it's a harder question, because if they go home to Massachusetts and then they don't re-enroll and they end up staying in Massachusetts, then they would have to apply in Massachusetts. But I think as long as they're intending to stay in school, they're enrolled for the fall semester or intending to enroll for the fall semester, then the case would be tied to New Hampshire. But the reason I said I would want to verify and make sure about that is I think it gets potentially a little tricky. And I feel like I had a case like this a while back, but I would want to refresh my memory. You know, if that student is under 21, or excuse me, under 22, let's say they're 21, and they go home and they're now in a household with their parent and siblings who have a SNAP case in Massachusetts, I still think what I'm saying applies, that their case would still be in New Hampshire because they're only temporarily in that home. They're not intending to remain there. They're going to go back to school. But that's a harder fact pattern that I would want to just double check on and make sure I'm right. So again, you know, kind of similar to what I was just saying to Julie, I think it's always best to stay in touch and communicate with DHHS. So I think that student would just want to be clear with DHHS and let them know, you know, I'm still enrolled, or I'm intending to enroll for the fall. I'm going to be living in Massachusetts for the next 2 to 3 months, but then I'll be back, and, you know, see if DHHS needs any verification about that and what they say. But I don't think they have to close their case, reapply in Massachusetts, and then reopen it in New Hampshire. That, to me, doesn't feel right, because potentially by the time they get the case, everything closed out and reopened in Massachusetts, they're then going to be back in New Hampshire and having to start that whole process. So I don't think the laws or policy require that, but it is a great question. I think these are the sorts of things that can come up that can cause confusion, both for recipients and I think for DHHS staff. And these are, you know, I think DHHS would be way more used to, we don't see a ton of these cases at NHLA. So I'm not, you know, there are questions I get that we see all the time that I'm more confident answering, but college students haven't, in my time at NHLA, typically called us with these sorts of issues. So usually I'm looking at them when I get great questions from you all in a presentation like this, but not necessarily in the course of our casework.
Thank you.
So thank you for the great questions. Any follow-up to that?
Ray, I know when we were working with the DHHS closely, that question came up and they said what you just said. So,
oh, great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Heidi. I appreciate that without having to look it up, I appreciate you letting me know that I wasn't completely off base there. So there's only a few slides left, but keep the questions coming. I just want to make sure, because I jumped into the question, just to reiterate this last bullet point. If the students are not eligible because they don't meet the rules we're talking about, then they're excluded and their income and resources wouldn't count for the other members. It's as if they're just, you know, for SNAP purposes, it's as if they're not in the home, even though they are. So there's no sort of, the rest of the family or household doesn't get penalized because the student isn't meeting these rules. Well, I mean, I guess they're potentially getting less SNAP than they would, depending on the income and other factors, but otherwise there's no, you know, the other family members can still get SNAP. I think some of this we talked about based on the great questions, but eligible students remain eligible between school breaks, vacations, summer, unless the student graduates, is suspended, expelled, drops out, or doesn't intend to return and register for the next school term. And the same thing applies in terms of ineligible students remain ineligible between school breaks. So, you know, the reason it's stated like this is because of what I was saying. If you don't meet these rules and you're enrolled in school and you're excluded, once you're on summer break, you can't then be added to the household. If you're intending to stay enrolled, you're enrolled for the fall semester, for example, you're still considered subject to these student rules. So being on summer break doesn't automatically exempt you. You still have to meet one of those other exemptions, unless you're no longer intending to remain enrolled.
Ray, you have a raised hand from Julie.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Julie. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm sorry.
No
Quick
worries.
question. Oh, I'm muted.
No, you're off
Oh,
now.
no, I'm
Sorry,
not.
I thought you were
Okay.
starting to talk.
So during the summer, they can work as much as they want and it's not going to affect, because one thing I've noticed is throughout all of this and eligibility, you haven't actually mentioned an income threshold. So does that mean in the summer they can just work 60 hours a week if they want? Because a lot of them do to save up money.
So this would go back to they still are subject to all those other rules. So there still is an income rule. So if their income significantly increases in the summer, they would have to report that generally, and that would be factored into their SNAP budget. I don't have it in this slide. If we have time, I think we're kind of running short on time, but the general, if you look at the DHHS website, most people are subject to the gross income limit of 200% of the federal poverty level for the per house, based on their household size. So they are still subject to those income rules. But there's as with everything, there's a complicated layer to that.
Of course.
Because if their income was already over 130% of the federal poverty level when they certified for SNAP, then they're actually not obligated to report that change until they're due to recertify. So again, when in doubt, I think the best course of action is to notify DHHS of changes to avoid any problems. But the rules are a little more complicated, and these reporting rules, as kind of we were talking about at the beginning of the meeting, the reporting rules are often designed to be helpful to people when they can, but they're often complicated and people don't fully understand them. But the short answer is there's still an income limit. There's not, college students aren't exempt from an income limit.
So are you saying there's an income limit based on top, in addition, the regular income limit, in addition to these criteria, one of these criteria? Because what I don't understand is how can you work 20 hours a week? Most students earn, say, 16, 17 hours, and which is a requirement, but yet the income, doesn't 20 hours a week automatically put you over that?
So that's where it really depends on household size and other factors. So so you have to look at that chart of the federal poverty level and determine where they are based on their hours, their wages. So it is possible, but it just depends on who else is in the home and what their hourly wage is.
And food stamps is 200% of the federal.
For most households. So there's a whole other presentation on the other eligibility rules. But for most households, it's 200% of the federal poverty level. There are households that are exempt, and there are households that might be subject to a lower limit, but most households are going to be subject to 200% of the federal poverty level as a gross income limit. Then there's a whole thing that calculation that goes into the budget to determine if they're eligible and what amount they'll receive. But usually you can at least have an idea by looking at the 200% of the federal poverty.
Thank you.
Sure. And so I think we're right on time, but that was my last slide. Whoops, or did I miss one? Oh no, I think that was it. So really, I just want to end with letting people know when to refer people to someone like me and my colleagues. Really, anytime DHHS makes a determination in a case, if an application is denied or benefits are terminated or reduced, if they get a letter about a potential overpayment, really any problem, you can refer them to 603 Legal Aid. That's our sister agency that kind of does the initial intakes, and then it makes its way over to us. And once a week, we talk about all the new cases and try, if we have someone available, to investigate or represent someone. But I'm always happy, like I said, when I can, to answer questions either here in the SNAP Coalition or otherwise, depending on what case deadlines we have going on. So would be glad to stay in touch with people. So I don't know, I think, Tiffany, we're right at time if I'm looking at my clock, or maybe a minute over. I'm happy to stay on if people have questions, but I also want to be respectful if people need to go, don't feel like you need to stay on or even say goodbye. Feel free to sign off. But I appreciate all the great questions and the great participation and attendance we had today.